So we're going to start off now talking about researching, and you see I've basically got a blank slate here right now. Before I do so, I wanted to talk a little bit about the strategies, and because I really have dealt with them fairly briefly. My view is that the research on cognition and also the research on reading and reading as a composing process will come to bear as we expand upon these issues over in other lectures. The research, as we've sort of tried to explore how do we actually help these kids learn to learn, involves a fair amount of discernment relative to what are the sort of the reader-based clusters of skills and strategies we want to have students engage with. We don't think that the skills operate as separately as they've historically been taught. That as kids read, they bring clusters, then connecting ideas, cause effect, temporal and whatnot into play. And it's not just one skill being applied to reading. And then we're still plagued with the key issue of how do you actually, you can teach these kids these strategies and they can certainly apply them in the situation where you've guided them through things. Or if you remind them and you sort of say, hey, do you remember that strategy? Why don't you apply it here? But that still sort of falls short of what I think is the sort of the gold standard of having these kids do it themselves. And I suspect that I'm probably lean more to an orientation relative to the strategy development, which is more case-based. And very similar to some of the work that Rand Spiro has been doing on complex learning, where he's looked at how medical practitioners learn how to engage with different patients. And they acquire flexibility and adaptability across cases. And so as we are engaged in researching learning to learn, we need to, I think, open ourselves up to other approaches rather than just a gradual release of responsibility or the reciprocal one, to an orientation to how might we study how this occurs across cases. When one does that, one starts to sort of realize that, wow, maybe the way that we've got to begin to study this is across time, and using time as a measure in a couple of different ways. An approach which might be considered time series, where we look to see how people apply strategies not just once or twice, but when they're actually doing it with a teacher, but when the student's doing it on themselves, and just to sort of see how this learning is occurring. Because at the same time as we're trying to sort of see if in fact a child's learning is measuring up to the gold standard, what we also need to do is to study what we need to do as educators to support them acquiring this. One of the things that I find myself thinking about as we sort of have a case-oriented approach is also interweaving approaches to assessment which are also student-driven to some extent, where one encourages a look at what students are doing in a portfolio orientation. Not a portfolio that the teacher's controlling, a portfolio where the students are encouraged to look at themselves over time and to analyze how they and why they made the decisions they did. We did an interesting study quite a few years ago with portfolios. It was done by a person doing her doctoral thesis with me, Linda Fenner. And she was in her own 5th grade classroom looking at kids developing portfolio. And the kids would share their work and they would argue about it. She said, oh, Rob, this is not going well. And I said, well, let's listen to the arguments. And sure enough, over time, we noticed that their arguments with each other were getting more and more sophisticated. The criteria by which they judged each other's work became more and more sophisticated. It was stunning. And so I think sort of vehicles like portfolios might be a sort of a way by which we can encourage a person to reflect upon themselves and in the company of others to do so. So I think as we are proceeding with this research on learning to learn, we need to sort of open ourselves up to looking across time. Indeed, the use of time as a measure, as a window, I should say, to look at the effectiveness of different reading programs has been quite interesting, actually. And I'm talking about using it in a way that sort of involves a level of what might be called critical reflexivity. But if you look at governments and the public and the media, oftentimes have looked at time as a way to scrutinise whether or not they should have adopted a certain reading program or that the state invested in. For example, in California, they adopted it. Some places had adopted a approach which some people didn't particularly like, and so they wanted to argue that if you looked at, let's say it was 1985 to 1990, that this program was adopted in about this year here, and had been responsible for a decline in achievement testing. And so you sort of see that type of an analysis being done in the media, in business, but also in education, where people are looking for a reason to dismiss that. I don't have much faith in this sort of analysis, typically because I don't think these measures are very good to start with, and let alone to sort of be able to sort of line them up in a way that sort of suggests this was the reason for this type of thing is pretty, I think, fairly sloppy type of work. I much more prefer an approach which looks at time carefully. And occasionally what I've done with a population is I've used a staggered start approach. And so I might introduce a technique with one group in January, and then another group in February, and another group in March. And I might look to see with the first group, did they go up, continue to go up? And did this group that started in February stay about the same? And whereby you can begin to sort of see that, wow, when I introduced this to them in February, they started you started to see some sort of trajectory like that. I think gone are the days where we compared one method simply against another in a quasi-experimental fashion, and we viewed that as useful. Although a number of traditional researchers, particularly in special education, still put a lot of value on that type of thing. Now, going back to the learning to learn and moving beyond just the time consideration, I want to also focus briefly on what I've suggested here, somewhat incidentally, is that the key thing you're after is whether or not there's evidence that these kids can do it for themselves, and whether or not there's evidence that they can do it in tasks that aren't the same as what's gone on in school. And so what you're after in one sense is what some people might consider to be post-test, delayed post-test, and transfer to other tasks. And so if I've developed a strategy, I'd like to sort of say, okay, I've stopped teaching the kid on the strategy, and then I can sort of show, hey, the kid's ability to use this strategy is still present. You can see it in the post-test. And guess what? I wait a little longer. You can still see it in the delayed post-test. And when I present this person other tasks, they do it for themselves. I hate to say it, but rarely have we achieved this. And so I encourage you to engage in work related to this, because I think this is not just the gold standard. This is what teaching and learning should be all about. I would suggest in closing out this lecture that this gold standard is almost, from my perspective, almost equivalent to a turn that has occurred in society. Where in society now we're much more conscious of sustainability and ecology. And in schooling, with this emphasis upon helping kids learn to learn for themselves, I think it's as significant a turn, where our focus becomes not just whether or not kids can perform with our help, I mean, we know that's pretty easy to pull off, but whether or not we can actually get them to learn for themselves in ways which extend beyond our teaching and maybe exceed our teaching. And as governments, whether in China or the US or Canada, strive for people who are innovative and creative, I believe that the heart of their innovation and creativity has to do with the fact that these folks are very good in terms of being connoisseurs of their own learning and know how to be strategic as they problem solve. It's that type of learning that, when it does occur in the classroom, brings a brilliance to the classroom, which is just so much more wonderful than the sort of learned passivity that we could be perpetuating by the sort of teacher-driven and not student-focused approach. So I hope you go away and think a little bit more about this learning to learn and get interested in it, and ask yourself the question, when you look at the research on teaching or the discussions of teaching, how far do these people go? And here we're talking about it in the context of strategies for reading, but these also could be strategies for to do with moral character, or strategies to do with all sorts of aspects of life. Thank you.